Greetings and welcome to yet another episode of Into Zimbabwe. My name is Liam Kanenga and I am your host. So today, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Monitors platform joins the rest of the nation of Zimbabwe in commemorating 41 years of independence. So today we're going to evaluate Zimbabwe's independence against a constitutional checklist where we will be assessing how far have we fared so far as Zimbabwe in as far as independence is concerned, particularly looking at human rights in the status quo. So a brief background is that independence is not a new concept to Zimbabwean political discourse, and neither is it a new concept to any Zimbabwe at all, even pre-independence, because we used to have the unilateral declaration of independence under Rhodesia, which was declared by Ian Douglas Smith in 1965, where without any agreement with the United Kingdom monarchy, he declared that Rhodesia itself, or Southern Rhodesia, was independent from the United Kingdom monarchy, and they answered not to the monarchy or to the British Crown. What did independence mean to Ian Douglas Smith? It meant sovereignty. It meant that the Southern Rhodesian government could be self-determining. It could make its own policies, its own decisions, choose its own friends without any gratification or intervention from the royal crown. Equally, it also meant that there was going to be self-rule, as it entails. It also meant that the Republic of Rhodesia was an independent polity that could influence and also decide on its own. So now, things that came along with this were firstly unpacked in three stages. One, there was still minority rule. White people, of course, still remained in government, and there was still political exclusion of black people. There was racial injustice and racial inequality, as well as social inequality, as the majority of the people were disenfranchised. So in the end, independence at that time did not entail freedom, but it only entailed the ability and space to rule thyself as a nation, Rhodesia in particular. Then we come back to 1980, where Zimbabwe now was reborn, or Zimbabwe itself was born as a nation free from the Rhodesian rule now. And what did it mean? It meant the installation of majority rule, where we saw Robert Mugabe being elected the first prime minister of Zimbabwe with a black government and a black legislation. In the end, also again, we saw the restoration or the installation of the first Zimbabwean constitution, which was taking its spirit and principles from the Lancaster House Agreement. And then we also saw the existence of new black-led political formations, and with policies that were pro-poor, pro-black, and that tried to restore the dignity of black people in Zimbabwe. But there are two things that we ought to measure against this factor of independence, and that is independence versus freedom. Does independence really entail freedom, and does freedom really entail independence, or are the two interlinked? Let's look at status quo today. In an independent Zimbabwe, 40 years later, we've seen a government that is occupied by a ruling party that has attempted to impose a one-party state on the people, where non-affiliates of ZANU-PF or people that are non-ZANU-PF are branded as enemies of the state. Whenever you are branded an enemy of the state, it simply means that the state's machinery is out to get you. It's out to repress you, eliminate you for good. It's never going to negotiate with you. It's never going to accommodate you. That's the first thing. And that entails that there is no political freedom for many, because anti-establishment views or divergent views are not tolerated. And this is the same thing that existed during the UDI in 1965. Secondly, we're going to look at the right to freedom of speech, right to freedom of movement, and right to freedom of expression. During UDI, there was no right to freedom of movement and speech, as well as freedom of assembly of the black people, because the NDP, the National Democratic Party, of the late 1950s to the early 1960s was banned. Equally, ZANU-PF as a political movement, it once upon a time was banned. Now, in status quo today, we see the same traits being carried over into Zimbabwe, where ZANU-PF as a ruling party with access to government or occupying the majority of the seats in government has been pushing agendas that close out the democratic space such that opposition is criminalized. We've seen how opposition gatherings are thwarted, they are crushed, they are stopped with the use of legislation like the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act. We've seen the use of the intrusive legislation like the Private Voluntary Organizations Act, as well as the use of clawback laws in the form of limitations to human rights that are prescribed under Chapter 4 of the Zimbabwean Constitution. And this itself entails constitutional weakness and constitutional death in a country that claims to be a democracy, and that itself, post-independence or post-liberation war, means that there is no freedom, yet we still have independence, because Zimbabwe still is a self-ruling nation. So for freedom now, we have to look at one's space and ability to make their own choices, as well as to affiliate or choose to associate with however and whoever they want, without any public pressure, without any cohesion, without any limitations or any form of torture or repression in their process of doing so. Freedom entails that one also is allowed space to be treated as an equal. That means there is a principle of equality within every nation that upholds freedom as a space of governance. It means that even if we disagree in terms of our lines of affiliation, we still fall under the same laws, we still respect the same constitution, we are still treated the same in courts of law, we are even treated the same in the political spaces. We all have the right to vote, we all have the right to say what we think, what we see. Nothing is termed criminal or nothing is alienated out of the fact that within a free nation, human beings are equal. There is a sense of equality, there is gender equality, there is equality across identities, there is no imposition of what we call tyranny of the majority. Every voice matters. This is how we get to say all Zimbabwean lives matter. So now we have to evaluate now the principal meaning or the philosophy of freedom vis-a-vis what is happening in status quo in Zimbabwe today. And this is what we have to look at. The first one being political rights, the second being social rights, economic rights, as well as social justice itself as a pillar. Now, getting into political rights, let's look at the right to freedom of assembly, right, in Zimbabwe, as prescribed in Section 67 of the Constitution. Do people really have the right to freedom of assembly in Zimbabwe? And based on the history of Zimbabwe since 1980, or starting from 1983, we saw Robert Gabriel Mugabe, the first prime minister or the first black prime minister of Zimbabwe, by then, who later became the first executive president of Zimbabwe and the first secretary of ZANU-PF, claiming that there was going to be a one-party state in Zimbabwe, and there was going to be no room for any party that was divergent or none other than ZANU-PF. And that was followed by a series of genocides and massacres, which were very brutal and violent against the opposing ZANU-PF, ZAPU, or PF ZAPU, which was equally a former liberation war movement that was once a member of the Patriotic Front that went to elections with Ian Douglas Smith and to negotiate at the Lancaster House. What did this entail? It entailed a lot of human rights violations, and it closed down. This is where the democratic space started to close down in Zimbabwe, because we saw detentions, we saw arbitrary arrests, we saw clampdowns, we saw police brutality, military terror, and harvest of fear on citizens in the southern regions of Zimbabwe, starting from Midlands, coming to Matabeleland, and anyone who supported PF ZAPU. We even saw Joshua Nkomo taking flight to the United States because his life was in danger out of being a leader of opposition. And they were labeled. In any political discourse, once we start affording each other labels, it means the situation has become brutal. It means there is no remorse. It means inferiority traits have been branded on each other, and we are no longer equals. So one is no longer free, right? And it means that violence becomes a means of communication systematically and physically, just like how the 5th Brigade was clamping down on PF ZAPU members. And this itself meant that there was not going to be room for anyone with divergent views other than those of ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. Then secondly, we're going to move into economic freedom. From early years after independence, we moved into a decade where new opposition outfits were cropping out. For example, Zoom, the Zimbabwe United Movement led by Edgar Tekere. There used to be an advert on the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation television where there was a car crash which says this is another way to die. And another way to die is voting for Zuma. So vote ZANU-PF and leave. That itself was a use of error and scary propaganda to send a chilling message to citizens that if they don't agree with ZANU-PF, they have no space to leave. They'll be denied their right to leave itself. So it means that opposition, as it is branded during time of elections and carried over after elections, which is something very problematic in Zimbabwe, was being officially banned. So political freedom was being limited, and the one-party state imposition system itself was clamping on people's rights or people's civil and political rights to participate and assemble or associate with whatever political outfit they chose to, right? And that itself is the beginning of election rigging, creating unfair competitive advantages against those that disagree with you, and you in that process will be taking away their freedom. So literally political freedom was relatively existent in Zimbabwe. Then we come into the early 2000s, where we now have formations like the Movement for Democratic Change. And the election periods during the early 2000s were marred with violence, they were marred with electoral contestations, and they still proceeded with acts of repression, banning of opposition gatherings through the use of the Public Order and Security Act known as POSA, which was used to disperse opposition gatherings, taking away, as I said before, their right to freedom of assembly, their right to gather, their right to freedom of association, right? And there was always public pressure to anyone who was a non-affiliate of ZANU-PF. We saw Morgan Tsvangirai, who was the then opposition leader at that time, being tried with treason. We saw Love Mo Maduku, the leader of a civic organization, the NCA, National Constituent Assembly, being repressed, subjected to police brutality, being incarcerated arbitrarily at Chikurubi Maximum Prison, and also the controversial arrest and death of Lenmo Judah Jongwe, who was the youngest politician at that time. So now there was a bit of identity discourse that struck up in political freedoms, or in the contest for political freedom, which is a generational discord where the young are being systematically excluded from spaces of politics and being repressed whenever they choose to take in positions by force. And then let's move on to today. Zimbabwe has seen a lot of generational renewal, where even leaders of opposition parties have become younger. For example, the Movement for Democratic Change so far is the youngest opposition leader in Zimbabwe, is aged 42, and his name is Nelson Chamisa, who equally is surrounded by a band of very young people who have decided to also participate in political discourse. One example is Makomborero Haruzivishe. Makomborero Haruzivishe is a human rights defender and leader of the People Power Movement, who is currently serving a year and 4 months in Chikurubi Maximum Prison after being convicted and sentenced for committing to incite public violence and disorderly conduct, as well as resisting arrest. But let's look at what Makomborero was really charged for. They say that he was in town during the time when police officers were dispersing vendors and he blew a whistle. So for blowing a whistle, he's termed to be inciting public violence. And out of the fact that he's an affiliate of the Movement for Democratic Change, which is a minority, a parliamentary minority, as well as an electoral opposition to ZANU-PF, he's then branded an enemy of the state, and whatever action he does to cohese or to promote public gathering is labeled as inciting public violence because it is a threat to the establishment. And that itself is taking away his right to assembly. And that is an example of how now opposition movements are being repressed in Zimbabwe, or non-affiliates to ZANU-PF are being repressed in Zimbabwe today. And we even have statements by the successive leaders of the ruling establishment, particularly Robert Gabriel Mugabe, who says the dissidents and their dissident father will be crushed. Then secondly, he says it's cold outside ZANU-PF. Then we have Emerson Mnangagwa, who says once you're outside ZANU-PF, your life is like a leaf off its mother's branch. You will dry out, wilt, and die. So in other words, it means that once you're not a member of ZANU-PF, or once you're not a supporter of ZANU-PF, your life typically and your freedom typically are repressed and they are taken away. You cease to be a free citizen in Zimbabwe. Economic freedom. Now, if we were to revise what happened, or what was one of the major anchored points of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe from 1963 to 1979, was economic freedom, where Robert Mugabe, as well as his other ZANU comrades, were preaching the Gutsa Ruzhinji rhetoric. The Gutsa Ruzhinji was premised upon the issue of economic equality in terms of accessing land. When we speak of land, we speak of agricultural land. We speak of land as space for mining. We speak about land for housing. We speak about land for owning the resources that endow it in the form of water sources, dams, etc. And all these things have a major role they play, or they are a major source of boosting the economy in terms of industry and production, as well as social welfare of the country. And land being the main means of production itself became the central point of economic freedom. Few black people could access land because of the Land Husbandry Act, as well as the native reserves creation by the settler regime, when black people were taken from fertile land into dry and arid lands in the form of Gwai and Shangani in the Matabeleland region, and some were moved to Mount Darwin in the Mazvikade and Otito regions, where it is very hot and hard to plow. So now independence meant the reinstallation of all that, where black people were also going to be given a chance to access their share as the majority to the main means of production, and that was to own land, be it for industry, for habitat, or even for mining. And then now today we're going to look at the major economic activities that are influenced or that depend on land. There is agriculture and mining. Agriculture has been on a low due to climate change, as well as global warming, as well as the economic decline in Zimbabwe. Inflation has made it hard to import inputs itself, as well as other things needed to boost the agricultural sector, as well as failed policies on the part of government. For example, the command agriculture that has been costing the country so much. And then we're also going to look at mining. Mining being the most lucrative because it is very inclusive. Everyone can do it in Zimbabwe, as well as also, again, looking at the fact that mineral production or mineral processing and mining themselves are very lucrative industries globally. So there is still a large market for minerals in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is one of the countries with the most mineral endowments in the world, looking at gold, diamond, lithium, coal in particular. So let's look at gold mining in Zimbabwe. It has been a sector that has been monopolized by those that are closer to the center of power. And the center of power entail the ruling party and government, where even it is said in rallies by the most general of the members that you cannot do mining here in Zimbabwe unless you are a friend of ZANU-PF. Even Emmerson Mnangagwa, the president of the republic, once upon a time at a rally in 2019 said, "We are the army, we are the government, we are the police, we are the majority, we are everywhere. So we determine who does farming, who does mining, and who does business in Zimbabwe." So in particular, there are rules to these things, and those rules entail being a friend or at least an affiliate of ZANU-PF. So economic freedom has been limited to very few people that agree with the ruling elite, and that itself has disenfranchised a lot, if not the majority of people in Zimbabwe. Looking at particularly young people constitute 67% of Zimbabwe's total population, and equally women, who constitute 51.3% of Zimbabwe's total population. So it means that the majority of Zimbabwean people are distant from the distribution machinery of resources in as far as economic freedom is concerned in Zimbabwe, and therefore they are not economically free because poverty rates are at 73%, as well as unemployment is at 85%. Jobs themselves are very limited and very scarce, and there hasn't been a major effort in order to promote generational renewal in the employment chain of the government itself as the largest employer. And now we see the initiation of a national youth service. The national youth service is going to is a policy that is going to be used to train young people to be resilient and patriotic citizens that are able to appreciate the need for hard work in order for them to succeed. What it means is that it's going to be used as a byline or a measure of who is going to get employment in Zimbabwe. So literally, the ZANU-PF government is going to impose a certain ideological congruence or ideological agreement for you to get a job. So it's going to hold the majority of Zimbabwe's population, the young people, ransom in order for them to get economic freedom. At a recent ZANU-PF gathering in Motoko, the main speaker of that day spelled it out clear and made it very uncategorical that for you to extract any precious resources in Zimbabwe, particularly mining gold, diamonds, chrome, or lithium, you ought to be a member of ZANU-PF, period.
Munhu wese ari pano ngatite chisungo chimwe chete kuti watoo member ye ZANU-PF. Totangira ipapo. Nokuti vana baba nana mai kana pasina zve ZANU-PF varume umwe munhu ngatotakure kabhegi kake aende kumba kwake. Muri kunyatsondibata. Vamarina ZANU-PF.
Now, statements like these entail that the one-party state agenda is still undercover and in progress of being implemented in Zimbabwe. Firstly, the closing down of political freedom. Then secondly, economic freedom is only afforded to those that are in it, those that are in the ruling party, to those that are closer to the center of power. So there will always be a limited hardline, or there will always be a criteria to who deserves what, when, and how in Zimbabwe's economy, in as far as affiliations are concerned. Academic freedom, or the right to academic freedom in Zimbabwe, a constitutionally guaranteed right which entails one's freedom to pursue knowledge or to produce knowledge without any fear of coercion or unnecessary public pressure or any hindrances. In that regard, the government is to make sure that it makes available all the necessary resources you need and all the necessary mechanisms within its reach to ensure that you access and enjoy that right, be it in primary school, in kindergarten, in high school, or in high and tertiary education spheres. So now, let's look at the issue of how universities, public institutions in particular, are captured as institutions of political imposition in Zimbabwe. All vice-chancellors are political appointees. They are all affiliates of ZANU-PF. And of note is the issue or the fact that these universities are managed by vice-chancellor, and of course they are governed by a chancellor. And the president of the Republic of Zimbabwe, who happens to be the head of state and government, the commander-in-chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, is also the chancellor of all state-owned universities or state-run universities in Zimbabwe. It means that there is a monopolization of discretion over the production of knowledge in Zimbabwe. And that itself is an imposition of a one-party's ideology over how knowledge ought to be produced in Zimbabwe. It is very different from the case of other nations. For example, in South Africa, chancellors are often appointed by an education board who will be very independent from the office of the presidency. They will rather report to the Ministry of Education. Here in Zimbabwe, it's the president over everything. There's an overarching factor to that right to academic freedom, where his ideology tends to influence much of how the universities are ran and governed and how education and knowledge themselves are given to people as a right. Now, what it means is that the university itself is censored upon the politics of ZANU-PF. It means that when it's censored upon the politics of ZANU-PF, there is mass infiltration and repression of divergent views. So it means certain subject areas of study are filtered out of the curricula. It influences the curriculum framing of how history can be biased towards one side and history can be biased against a certain group, and at the same time even collecting and assembling in activism or unions is problematic. For example, in Zimbabwe, there exist two dominant student unions: the Zimbabwe National Students Union, known as ZINASU, and the Zimbabwe Congress of Students Union, known as ZIKOSU. ZIKOSU is an associate of ZANU-PF, the establishment or the ruling party. ZINASU is independent and apolitical, and in most cases with divergent views to that of the establishment. And we have seen how selective the regime has been in terms of accommodating the two unions. It accommodates the Zimbabwe Congress of Students Unions more because it is that which it sees as legitimate out of its affiliation. And ZINASU has been treated off like a terrorist group, a regime change agent, and it has oftenly faced more repressions than ever. For example, the Zimbabwe National Students Union president has been arrested for a minimum of at least 6 times since June 2020 up to today. And he has spent a maximum of 50 days in a prison cell at Harare Remand Prison for only demanding justice, for only claiming his right to freedom of assembly, as well as right to academic freedom, where they produce knowledge and manufacture consent in societies by speaking out against what they observe as intellectuals. Now, this right itself has been subjugated in many ways. For example, the issue of capture, where vice chancellors, the chief administrators of universities, are political appointees. And that itself kills the institutional strength of public institutions or learning institutions. And then the imposition of even workers' unions in the education sphere. For example, the Zimbabwe Teachers Association, ZIMTA, is the only legitimately recognized teachers' union without any cohesion in Zimbabwe, as opposed to ATUs, as opposed to PTUZ. All these are other that are seen as divergent and regime change agents. They are criminalized, they are outlawed, and they are always repressed through the use of the Criminal Law and Codification Act and Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act in Zimbabwe, as well as the Private Voluntary Organizations Act. And with all these things, the Zimbabwean democracy has never been accommodative enough to afford all citizens the same amount of opportunity and access to academic freedom. And that remains a problem in Zimbabwe today. Lastly, let's move into justice. We're going to talk about social justice. Let's also talk about constitutional justice, distributive justice, identity and racial justice in Zimbabwe. Firstly, legally, Zimbabwe has a constitution, which was Constitutional Amendment Act number 20 of 2013, which was voted for by an overwhelming majority of people at a referendum for yes. And this constitution is expected to be protecting every citizen regardless of their class, gender, identity, religion, or creed. But in the recent years, we've seen how the constitution itself has been defeated and set aside in many ways. For example, the military-assisted power transition of 2017, where the laws governing how power should be transited, which is through elections, free, fair, credible elections, was set aside. And even the international conventions that support the use of those procedures were even set aside. For example, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, were set aside. And that itself has made it impossible, or has made it very rare, for the government in Zimbabwe to respect the constitution. Even the dispensation of Section 267 of political rights in Zimbabwe has made it very difficult. Even the issue of independent institutions, as provided by Section 158 of the Constitution, has been set aside. And that itself has impaired the criminal justice system in a way that has been biased or to the disadvantage of those that don't agree with the ruling party. And we've seen the incarceration of many opposition leaders. We've seen the incarceration of many human rights campaigners and pro-democracy activists in the past 6 months. And the record has it that the government has managed to incarcerate or arrest at least 4,450 human rights defenders in Zimbabwe since 2019. And almost 70 activists and opposition leaders have been abducted and tortured by the ruling party. Most of the actors or the perpetrators of these human rights violations have never been prosecuted. For example, Tawanda Mchehiwa's abductors, the car that they used was identified by its number plate, and it was even traced back to be a car that belonged to Impala Car Rental. But little to no efforts have been put by the government as to investigating who were the actors and who were the perpetrators and who abused Tawanda Mchehiwa. There has never been justice for him. As well as Itai Dzamara. He has been missing for nearly 6 years now. And there hasn't been any effort on the part of government as to investigating what went about and how did it go down to his missing, or even trying to recover his corpse if he is still alive or whether he's dead. There hasn't been any action on the part of government. And that itself shows that the criminal justice system itself is weak in Zimbabwe. There hasn't been much of its fruition since the last decade of independence up to today. Then we move on to social justice. The issue of equal access to opportunities, equalities, as well as distribution factors. We have seen how companies come and invest in certain localities. For example, Den Dairy seeks to invest in Chilonga, where it nearly displaced a tribe of 12,000 people from their ancestral land without even public consultation. And the government had initiated that policy by decree using statutory instrument number 50 of 2021. It shows that there is a lack of social justice in as to how citizens benefit from the economic progress of the country, or how they're excluded from the economic activity of the country, and that itself is pushing them to the periphery, and it is reducing Zimbabweans to undignified beings who rather depend on one center of power, which is very problematic in any constitutional democracy. Then we look at racial justice. In as much as the wounds and scars of colonialism are still fresh in the memories of Zimbabwe, it is also important to understand that post-independence and post the Liberation War, there was an agreement that we would treat each and every citizen as equal, each and every citizen fairly, each and every citizen as a dignified being. But we've seen tribal inequalities where the Chilonga people from a minority tribe were being displaced from their land, as opposed to what happens to the tribe from which the president comes from, the Karanga, who happen to be almost majority of the Zimbabwe, as well as the Zulu people. Such issues are selectively applied in Zimbabwe. Laws selectively applied to these people. Even development itself is selectively dispensed in Zimbabwe. You would see a lack of infrastructural development in the rural areas. Tape water distribution technologies are very rare in the rural areas in Zimbabwe. The best they've seen are boreholes. Tap water is rare. Clean water in suburban areas, especially in Bulawayo. Bulawayo is a case of reporting impure water since 2020, even in Chitungwiza. And with major focus to Bulawayo, it's out of its tribal setup, where the majority of the people that stay in Bulawayo are from the Ndebele origin, as opposed to the majority of those in government who are from the Shona, or particularly the Karanga and the Zulu origins, which is very problematic in as far as social justice is concerned. Then we also look at the issue of racial justice. The government still sees white people as enemies, which is very problematic, especially that we have naturalized people of Caucasian race who also need to be afforded the right to franchise, who also need to be afforded the right to political freedom, the right to freedom of expression, and it ought to be necessary that the government forgives the wounds of colonization. There ought to be some form of reconciliatory approach to the way that we as Zimbabwe, as a government, treat our white people. Yes, we do consider the government has made an effort in including a certain number of white people into government in positions of cabinet. For example, the Ministry of Youth, which is occupied by Honorable Kirsty Coventry. We've seen Honorable Haritatos, who is also a co-deputy minister in the Ministry of Agriculture, as well as Honorable MP Raj Modi from Bulawayo. Well, that is a step, but there ought to be more that has to be done in as far as racial justice is concerned in Zimbabwe. All of these problems, or all of these issues we have managed to put across today, emanate from issues to do with the existence of divergent political views, or rather the pursuit of trying to exclude other divergent views or other people's views in Zimbabwe. And the question is, what's really wrong with everybody just joining one party or getting along to agree on the same thing? The first things is on the basis of principle, legality, as well as individualism, individual opinions. For example, in terms of principle, there is corruption, there is nepotism, unfair distribution and appropriation of resources in Zimbabwe. Like I said before, during the land reform program. The land reform program was supposed to lift the majority of Zimbabweans out of poverty by giving them access to the main means of production in the form of land. But now we see that it benefited the ruling elite, those that were closer to the center of power or those that were in power. For example, the erstwhile president, Comrade Robert Mugabe, owned 12 farms, and then the incumbent president owns 8 farms. The vice president owns literally almost the same number of farms. Even when it comes to mining has been afforded to friends of the politicians that are in power today. For example, Kudakwashe Tagwire, who happens to own also a mining consortium as well as a fuel monopoly in Zimbabwe. So economic opportunities, because of corruption and nepotism, have been afforded to friends and allies of the ruling elite. And even when it comes to issues to do with power, there is a tone of dictatorship and a tone of monopolization of the rights to leadership in as far as the ruling establishment is concerned, where the military becomes a political god who determines who rules which party and who leads which government in Zimbabwe. For example, in the early 2000s, the late General Vitalis Navashe made a clear and very categorical statement that when it comes to issues of leadership in ZANU-PF and in Zimbabwe in particular, it's a straitjacket. It is only for war veterans. It literally meant that the next generation of citizens was never given space and was never going to be afforded space to take up leadership. And we have seen that 67% of Zimbabwe's population are born frees, people that were born post the war, people that have never seen the face of a battlefield, and they are being told openly that they can't access leadership. So that itself creates disgruntlement and disagreement. So offshoots and opposition competition during election is created in that form, because people start to create struggles and coalesce around ideas to restore or install certain strategic objectives, which is why it is different and difficult to have people align under one party. Secondly, the issue of nepotism, where people, only those that are affiliated to the ruling party or those that are related to those that are in the ruling party, get access to opportunities or at least get a fair chance of the law, which culminates to selective application of the law. We have seen Henrietta Rushwaya, who is alleged to be a niece of the president. She was caught with a bag of gold, with 6 kgs of gold, and she was attempting to smuggle it to Dubai. She was charged for illicit dealing and corruption, and later was released on $90,000 bail. But yet today, we have a young man who is not related to anyone in power, but equally a patriot who is willing to defend the democracy of his country, human rights of his fellow citizens, Makombora Reservation, who is being incarcerated for almost a year in prison, out of being charged for breaching the Criminal Law and Codification Act. So the selectivity there itself raises a problem, and this is what keeps on breeding rooms for disagreement and disharmony in the country. Then lastly is the political conduct of those that hold governing authority in Zimbabwe. ZANU-PF as a political party has remained or has chose to remain in perpetual election mode, where it carries over political identities or political brands into post-election periods. For example, the use of the term opposition. The concept of opposition only exists as one contest in elections, right? Where one gets to say, no, I'm an alternative to the candidate there at hand. That's where people only exist as opposition. Post-elections, where others have seats in parliament, you become one government, you become part of the state, you start to rule or you start to govern on behalf of the people collectively, because people don't see MDCIs, they don't see ZAPU, they don't see ZIPRA or NCA after elections, they see a government. But the carrying over of these brands has led to repression of other citizens. It has led to oppression, it has led to exclusion, it has even led to capture of the state, which has had harsh consequences on the majority of the citizens who happen to be the most general occupants of the state. People who expect material objectives, material gains in the form of education, good services, social welfare, social care, free health care, are the ones that suffer in that name, because they are being imposed into a decision of trying to affiliate or identify with a certain brand, which is unjust and very problematic in as far as governance is concerned. So that is the major bundle of problems in as far as the independent Zimbabwe is. So what should be done? Firstly, there should be reconciliatory efforts. There should be a commission of peace, truth, and reconciliation, so that at least we have transitional justice and we at least build peace and unify the nation as patriots. Secondly, there is need to prosecute all perpetrators, be it from opposition or the ruling party, of human rights violations in Zimbabwe. Thirdly, there is need to release all prisoners of conscience and afford everyone their right to freedom of assembly, and restore or reinstall the respect and strength of the Constitution as a governing law of the land. Only then will our independence and freedom become realizable material artifacts of the country. It is only then that our independence in Zimbabwe would make sense to the grandmother in Chilonga there, to the young boy playing football in Budiriro there, to the young student in a university library at National University of Science and Technology there, to that lady wearing a nurse's dress at Chitungwiza Hospital, to that grandfather who is waiting for his pension in the suburbs of Mbalabala, to that lecturer who is waiting to deliver and produce knowledge so that tomorrow there is more labor and there are more graduates to produce more knowledge and to develop this country. And even to that football player playing for Harare FC, Bulawayo FC, Chicken Inn FC. That is how Independence Cup today, as Dynamos plays against Highlanders, would make sense to citizens in Zimbabwe. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Liam Kaninga. I am your host. This was Into Zimbabwe. See you next week.